but that is not permanent. Even if we keep getting better control of the coronavirus, we won't get a handle on climate change so easily. Global warming is progressing, and if we continue to burn fossil fuels, development will accelerate. Now that everyone is returning to their jobs step by step, and we are investing billions to get our economy going again, we shouldn't fall back into old polluting habits. When we invest in renewable energy, drive cleaner cars, renovate our homes, and make them more energy efficient, we are doing the environment and ultimately ourselves a favor. We make our society and our environment healthier when we buy sustainable food or reuse products instead of throwing them away or making low-carbon steel. This is the heart of our European Green New Deal and the European Development Plan that the European Commission proposed in May 2020. We want to get out of this crisis stronger and healthier than we went in, and we can. So I want to give you a short idea about the first panel, Smart, Artificial and Artistic Intelligence, and I want to kind of get into the thinking that the first life forms 1.0, hardware and software evolved. So the beings evolved and the programs, how they react and how they interact with the environment had evolved. We have Life 2.0, this is more or less us, where the hardware, our body, has evolved, but our software is partly designed. So this is why we go to school, and this is why we go to university, is to get new software, how to react and how to get knowledge. And this is also why cultures are somehow different, because they get different softwares in more or less the same evolution body. And now we are close to something that could happen soon. It's Life 3.0, where the hardware and the software is designed. And this gives a huge opportunity, but also an incredible challenge. So we talk a lot about disruptive technologies, and a lot of young startups, especially in Silicon Valley, they love this word disruptive. But we should be sometimes careful, because we disrupt since we work on, we have this effect on our environment, we are super agents in our biosphere, we disrupt sometimes too much. And it's just kind of sometimes short-term profits. But of course, all those disruptive technology will come, and we will have to find a way how cleverly and with a new ethics work on those new technologies. And this has also a lot to do with convergence of technologies, and I think next year we will talk a lot about the next big thing which is coming, the convergence of bio, nano, and infant technology, which will create a huge amount of problems for us in regard of being controlled. With all those things together come those ideas of human enhancement. We could now work on our DNA, we could now work in our brains, and of course the AI and the robot revolution, which might take away a huge amount of the professions we are used to. But I think as intellectuals, we should not be so much afraid of artificial intelligence, because as intellectual intelligence is always a challenge, not a problem, but we should be very much afraid of natural stupidity. Future startups have a very simple formula, and this is take whatever you have and add artificial intelligence, and you get a new disruptive startup. You have an intelligent toothbrush, intelligent cars, intelligent chairs. So whatever you think exists, you can add intelligence, and then you have a new startup. But will this be colleagues, or will that be competition? And of course it will be both, but there will be a lot of competition, and there is a huge danger that when we think about the working class, in older times, capitalists didn't like the workers, but they needed them to exploit them. When we have all this automatization, the bots and the artificial intelligence, they don't even need some people, and a lot of people on our planet, not even to exploit them. They are just useless. And that will make a lot of influence on how democracy is changing, how political powers are shifting. So when we look at the AI landscape, we see that it's like with climate change, the flood is rising, and whatever we thought artificial intelligence cannot do now, they might be able to do that in a couple of years. But we see on this artificial intelligence landscape that something like art, cinematography, book writing, science, and AI designs are the top mountains where artificial intelligence has the biggest problem to take over. And I will try to tell you what. But the thing is, when AI designs AI, the big difference between biological intelligence and artificial intelligence is when we have created an Einstein algorithm. Yeah, it can be replicated, duplicated in seconds for almost zero marginal costs. So it will or Michelangelo, even their children or their students will not necessarily be genius. But when we have an artificial intelligence, a program, an algorithm, they will kind of never go back, but also that will be the next level, and then they will go on. And this is the reason why we have to think about that. Of course, they will, in a lot of territories, will take over because they will have an evolution of becoming better, which is not possible in biological evolution. So a lot of people think that the future is the technicum. We are, as humans, the fathers of a new species of machines. And we should think about how we have all the evolution, the five kingdoms, and we will more or less find a new kingdom. But it's still on us how this kingdom will look like. So the first thing what we have to do is changing the educational system. And I think art teaching could become more important than math in a tech-based future. Our educational system is still out of the 19th, where we kind of educate workers and educate soldiers who can make the task to carry out complicated commands. But these talents we don't probably need anymore in the future. So we should focus on education on complete different things. And when we look what artificial intelligence is really good at, we know what we should use as educating because it's specific human. And the thing is, artificial intelligence can really be good in giving answers when we ask the right question, because they can go to big data. And when answers become cheap, questions become the new wealth. And Albert Einstein said, I was neither clever nor especially gifted. I was only very, very curious. And when we look now to the schools, if students ask interesting questions, normally they are considered to disturb the school. Yeah? And questions are not giving the right answers, but questions will become the new wealth. There was this theory of right brain talents, and we know now that it's not really true, but there's this idea that left brain talents are kind of logic, algorithms, and the right brain talents are very different. We know that it's not true, but it gives us a good hint to where we have to look at. The one thing is computers do not dream. They have no kind of imagination. They don't feel in their subconsciousness things coming up, which is very, very specific to humans and animals. They have no empathy, no moral, no ethics. And even if we try to train them in ethics, that will be very complicated because it became very, very quickly became an absolute value, and moral and ethical values are values which are in a context. But one of the biggest things, and this is where the whole future design comes about, imagination. Computers cannot imagine a different world or another world or alternative futures, because they use the data from today and they calculate them into the future, and there, of course, exists something that all the problems we have now will be kind of computed into the computer. And a couple of years ago, I searched for CEO, and I got around more or less 1,000 white elderly men, I think 2 Indian guys and 1 Afro-American, and the only woman which was shown up was Barbie, because there's a Barbie which is called CEO. So when we take this data and we look for a new head of the ZKM, for example, then we know what will be the outcome. But when we future design, we can think about it in 2030. 50% of all major jobs on the planet will be headed by women, and then the AI will make completely different choices. So it's still on us what we kind of ask the artificial intelligence to compute. So one of the things we will discuss today very, very much is creativity. We don't know exactly what creativity is. We have some ideas what creativity might be, and every job nowadays is kind of asked, you have to be creative. The good thing on creativity is, as we don't know exactly how it works, we cannot program it. So we will discuss today how our artists work creatively with AI, and we will of course discuss the question, are those algorithms created by them still tools? And this comes up with idea of like the next Rembrandt when we teach an AI with all the data necessary of some artists. Of course, it can look for the patterns and create something which looks very, very much like this artist, like the next Rembrandt. But what is for me very, very interesting is, I call it art, AI, and uncertainty, or fussiness, or vagueness, or blurriness. When we look at music, we have a connotation which is quite to the point. Yeah? A note is a note, and a rhythm is a rhythm. And there's only a short, a little part of blurriness in it, what we call interpretation. When we go to poetry, which has a lot of meanings, where is irony, where is symbolism, artificial intelligence can never understand a double meaning. When I say something, but I mean another thing. Yeah, this is far away for where I can reach. So when we look at the different arts, how much context, how much subtext is in different art forms, then we know what kind of art forms are will not very soon be kind of taking over by artificial intelligence. So we discussed today a lot in the actions of artists and artificial intelligence. How can artists use those tools? And one of the first things is Matthias Röder, who worked on an AI and tries to finish the unfinished Beethoven Symphony. We will talk with David Murray Russell on the potential of new human and machine interaction. We will talk with some old friends of our research on artificial intelligence, some pioneers on the work of artists in artificial intelligence, Roman Lipski and Florian Doman. On their project, they created an artificial intelligence which gives inspiration to the painter Roman Lipski, but now they are in an advanced phase of their project, and they call it Post-AI, Beyond Routines from Life Without a Muse. And we will talk about transformative AI with the artist Refik Anadol, and after the panel, we will show 1 hour works of Refik. So our moderator will be Holger Volland. He is the vice president of the Frankfurter Buchmesse, and he is one of my favorite speakers and one of my favorite authors. He wrote this incredible book on the creative power of machines. And I heard that he's writing on a new book, will comes out in March, and I think he has some time left to tell us a little bit about also his new books, but he will moderate this panel, and that is for me for today, and I will give over to Holger, and I hope you enjoy our first panel. Hi.
Thank you, Ludger. Thank you so much. So good morning also from my side, and I don't know whether you saw it during the introduction from that you heard before from Ludger, that we sort of start with the dinosaur of conference formats. We start with an all-male panel. I know this seems out of time, but due to cancellations by speakers, today's panelists unfortunately ended up being all men. Of course, this is not the standard of the Beyond Festival, and those of you who've worked with Güsel and Ludger know that this festival is being far away from a white boys club. There had been many all-women juries and panels in the last years, and also if you look at this year's speaker list, you'll find an incredible diversity of voices from all over the world, and of course, also from all genders. Nevertheless, conference panels always reflect real lives inequality in academia, in science, and in society. And if you look, for example, for creative AI experts, you'll still find 6 men and only 1 woman. And only a smart percentage of those you find are people of color or non-binary tech experts. And I'm quite sure that we're going to touch that topic as well during the next 3 days. So let's see today's panels as a strong call for more diversity in public speaking as well. On these notes, I'd like to start the first panel of Beyond 20, which is a virtual Beyond 20 for the first time. And because this is the year 2020, we're going to start talking about crises. Our recent crisis, of course, is Corona, but there's also a long-term crisis, climate change. And in addition, the world has many more problems, like the beginning tech war between the US and China, nationalism and racism, the fight for freedom, land and justice for many indigenous groups, and many, many more. So if we look at the news, and especially on social media, we see a world that is deep in trouble with hardly any hope. Now, I have my fair share of doom scrolling, but I'm also a big fan of Hans Rosling and of Steven Pinker. And their incredible books that you should all read show that almost all data reminds us that in history of humans, there has been never a better time to live. Never had there been more health, less poverty, less death by war, less hunger, for example. Humans have managed to provide all the resources that could lead the whole world into a better future. Now, what to do with these 2 extreme poles? The dooms, on the one hand side, our fears, anxiety, social media, the threats, and on the other side, data, knowledge, science, the facts. How can we move from fear to action? And what, during this move, is the role of the arts? Let me tell you a story. Now, I work for Frankfurt Book Fair, as Ludger said, which is kind of the United Nations for stories. And it has been for 500 years or so. And during the last book fair, we invited an incredible woman, the activist Memory Banda, to speak about her successful campaign against child marriage in Malawi. The young woman managed to raise the minimum legal marriage age in that country and ended the horrible tradition of initiation camps. In these camps, young girls were initiated into sex by older men, and they were forced to take part in these camps. So how did Memory manage to change these very strong and very old traditions in her country? By stories. She convinced a whole community, she convinced a whole country by telling stories. Memory collaborated on a storytelling project called River of Life, where the girls shared their experiences, their horrible experiences, and also their dreams of a better world, their hopes. The project turned into a national advocacy campaign, and in 2015, child marriage was banned in Malawi due to stories. So storytelling can be the most powerful tool to change people's mindset, to change their behavior. And who are the best storytellers? Of course, it's artists. So the changes of the current global civilization are therefore also challenges for the art. And much of what will happen during the next years will be driven by technology. Trends like virtual reality, big data, robots, artificial intelligence are being accelerated even by the corona crisis at the moment. And while technology evolves at a very fast speed, society is sometimes left behind because people just don't understand what is happening in technology. So my main question always is, how can the arts, how can creative people generate new opportunities for social, economic, ecological, and artistic transformation by helping people to understand what technology can do in a good way, but also in a bad way. Artists are among the first ones who are not only allowed, but actually expected to provide visions and forecasts. Artists have access to powerful people. Artists can create tools that help everybody to find their voice, and artists can help us to get rid of routines and shared beliefs. And we're going to talk about all these topics during the next panel. So without further ado, let me introduce the first panelist to you. It's the dear friend of us, Matthias, Dr. Matthias Röder. He's the co-founder and managing partner at The Mindshift, a consultancy on creative leadership. He holds a PhD in music from Harvard University and the Mozarteum. Matthias currently serves also as a board member of the Karajan Foundation, and he's a member of the board of trustees of the Mozarteum Foundation and also managing director of the Eliette and Herbert von Karajan Institute. And Matthias Röder asks, will we compose music with artificial intelligence? Enjoy.
Okay, Matthias? Wir können ihn noch nicht hören.
Can you hear me?
Matthias, you can start.
So thank you very much, Holger, for your nice introduction. I am really excited to be here with you today. It's not the first time that I'm in a virtual conference, but this one is a different setup, so I'm very excited. I have my timer running, 10 minutes, I was told. I want to talk to you about artificial intelligence and music. I want to start with a story of around Ludwig van Beethoven, who's and for that reason is one of my favorite composers to be super creative, pushing the boundaries of what music is many times in his life. And this story is about a rehearsal of one of his later string quartets. Beethoven is there with the Schuppanzig string quartet, and they rehearse a very complex, difficult passage. And the first violinist, Ignaz Schuppanzig, he stops and he says, well, Beethoven, this is not possible to play. You surely do not consider this to be music, do you? And Beethoven replies to Schuppanzig, you surely do not think that I composed it for you. I composed it for the future. So Beethoven has been someone who was pushing the boundaries of music all the time. And so when I was asked a year ago by Deutsche Telekom if I think it would be possible to take the sketches of Beethoven's 10th Symphony and with the help of artificial intelligence complete it, I said, well, I don't know if it's going to be like Beethoven, as you know, innovative and creative, but we will sure try, because Beethoven himself, he would have tried out this new technology himself. So essentially, when you look at scores by Beethoven, then you see that it is a big mess, and a lot of creative mess is on the paper. I want to start by showing you an image from these sketches of Beethoven's 10th Symphony. And for that, I'm going to share my screen. Can someone allow me to share the screen? So while we're waiting for the technology to show my screen, I want to explain to you what the challenge is. If you look at a score by Beethoven, the handwriting is really, really difficult to decipher. And I hope you will be able to see the screen now. So this is a typical page from a sketchbook, and you can see it's a complete mess. First of all, we have to go in there, we have to transcribe it, we have to turn it into modern day notation. And then what we did is we gave it to the AI that we trained, and the AI takes the music by Beethoven and then continues the musical thread. And I have an example for you that I would like to play. I believe that you will be able to hear this quite well. What you'll hear is, first of all, the sketch as Beethoven wrote it down. This is something that we prepared last year. And I invite you to think, where does Beethoven end and where does the AI begin? I'll stop here. As you can hear, it's very hard to distinguish where the sketch of Beethoven ends and where the AI starts. It's in fact only 12 seconds of Beethoven's music, but the AI has picked up on it quite well. Now, how do we actually do this? First of all, of course, this is a big team effort. And you can imagine that something like this is requiring expertise from many different areas. So I want to single out Ahmed El-Gamal, who is the head of the research AI research lab at Rutgers University and is the scientific head and researcher of this project. So together with Ahmed, we created and we trained an artificial intelligence that has listened to a lot of music, first of all, of course, by Beethoven, but also contemporaries of Beethoven. And it is through this process of training that the AI has actually acquired a sense of the style of Beethoven's composition. Now, what's of course interesting is that the AI, as you feed it with information and with sketches by Beethoven, will produce a lot of different variants. And so as we work with this AI, this is changing the way in which we actually are creative ourselves. And we have a composer on our team, Walter Wurzowa, who is listening to all of the output of the AI and then working together with the technical team is refining the output, pointing to areas which are good, pointing to areas which are not good. And in this iterative process is actually enhancing the quality of the AI. Now, we did all of that work over the course of the last year. And through continuous refinement, we arrived at a point where now we can give the AI a piece of Beethoven's sketch, and it gives us hundreds of variations on the sketch and a continuation, a possible continuation in the style of Beethoven. Of course, you know, we are far from pressing a button and getting a finished symphony out of this. So what we did is we have all of these variants that the AI produced, and we are now picking certain moments and putting them together in a collage. And this is done again by the human team, in particular by Walter. So you could think of this system then as a system in which machine creativity and human creativity work hand in hand. And in fact, the way that you approach a project like this is by, first of all, finding a common ground for talking about these issues. An engineer and a musicologist and a composer do not necessarily share the same vocabulary, nor the same aesthetic ideals. And as the project progressed, we were able to find a way to talk to each other, to understand what someone means when they say we have to adjust weights in a certain part of the algorithm so that it can do X, Y, Z. And the composer says, yes, but I want it to be more motivic, or I want it to be more, lush, or with more power. So all of these issues we had to solve in the process. Now, my time is almost over. I just want to leave you with a thought that is important for me personally, and I hope also resonates with you guys out there. For me, creativity is always, beginning from human expression, the urge to be expressive as a human. But technology plays a very important role in this, and technology is the enabler for our human creativity and for sort of the things that we would like to achieve through our art. A lot has been written in the press about AI versus human. And now AI can compose almost as good as Beethoven. Do we still need composers? Of course we do. And I believe very strongly that a technology like this one will in the future be part of musical instruments like keyboards. It will be part of course, the software in which we compose, and it will serve our creativity, and it will serve us to create greater and different and, hopefully successful pieces of art in music, in the performing arts, and also in painting and sculpture. So for me, AI stands for augmented intelligence, and it doesn't stand for artificial intelligence. And I know that my time is over now. I just wanted to leave you with that little thought there. What if any kind of musical instrument, any kind of technology you use to create music would be intelligent and would be able to support you? Wouldn't that be an amazing situation, that everyone who's picking up an instrument for the first time will be able to express themselves rather than having to go through 15 and 20 years of training before they can produce something that is meaningfully expressing their emotions? I'm looking forward to discussing this and other topics with you later on, and I give back to Holger.
Thank you very much, Matthias Röder. And what we see now here is also the limitations of the virtual version of this conference, because usually when you meet Matthias and also Seda, his wife, in person, what they do is they make always music. They always grab a piano somewhere or other musical instrument and they make music. So we hope that we experience some of that later. But let's continue with this first panel, and I'd like to introduce Dave Murray Rost to you. Dave is designing with and around intelligent infrastructures. He's a lecturer in design informatics at the University of Edinburgh. He studied information systems in Cambridge, informatics and artificial intelligence, and music in Edinburgh. And his work is concerned with ways that people, data, and things interact. And Dave asks, can we create relationships with intelligences? Dave.
Thanks very much, Holger. It's great to speak after Matthias because there's some very nice connections there. I'm going to start with the difficult technical issue of sharing my screen. So let's see if I can find the correct window for doing it. I think I'll have to use this one. Share. Okay. Excuse me a minute. Right. So hopefully that's visible to everyone. I'd like to talk about creating relationships with intelligences, and what I'm interested here is figuring out how, as creators and as humans, we can better understand what AI can do and what it can't do, and where the exciting bits for creativity lie. So I'm interested in all sorts of ways that people and things interact. And I tend to talk a lot about animacy, and it's the property of things in the world to feel a little bit alive and a little bit responsive. And for me, this is a very nice lens because it sidesteps some of the questions about consciousness and gets into the heart of the experience of how we relate to stuff. And often that has to do with responses and movement and the various ways that things feed back to us. I'm interested in things like surprise and joy and how we can look at distributed systems in a playful way. But then this comes back into how we can look at all the moments that take place within an interaction, because they tell us a lot about how people feel about things and about how they respond. And I'm very interested in how we can use things like critical design to look at these technologies and say, well, if I'm sitting on a chair that has a smart fabric sensor and it can sense my bum print and hence read my emotional state, well, whose chair is it and who gets to see that data and who is in control of this? So creative practice can really help us to understand the implications of emerging technology, and to look not just at the stuff itself, but at all of the relationships behind it, and see AI not just as an algorithm, not just as the data that it's running on, but as the collection of things that have brought it to be in that place and that have given it certain kinds of power to act. So here I'm going to talk about how we relate to AI when we're creating. I've put AI in square brackets because it's a really problematic term, because everyone has a different sense of what it means and a different set of qualities that they associate with AI, and it can cause a lot of arguments. And for the way I look at it, most of the time we don't need to engage in those arguments. So to talk about this, I'm going to go back to work that I did in my PhD, where I was very interested in how we can make computers that improvise with people. And my idea here was not so much to replace human improvisers, but to try and understand what they were doing through creating something that did something similar. So I made a system that would listen to what people were playing in various ways, and it would then try and situate its playing relative to that. And the whole time I was doing this, people would ask me the question, is AI trying to replace human musicians? Or am I trying to replace human musicians? And I had a very simple answer to this: no. And the reason for me is not about the capabilities of AI, it's about the qualities of humans. I think most of the music that gets made in the world is made because a person wants to make that music. And I don't think technology will ever change that. So for me, it's about finding the ways where AI can fit in and augment, exactly as Matthias said, augment what we can do and extend our capabilities in various ways. And so for most of this talk, I'm going to look at ways where that comes in and what it feels like. And really ask, why might we want to bring AI into music, and what are the things that it does? So one of the key ideas here for me is mutual intelligibility. This goes back to Lucy Suchman. And I'll come back to this image a bit later on, but this is two AIs having a discussion with each other in very different domains. And for me, mutual intelligibility is interesting because it acknowledges that that AI will not understand everything about us. We might not understand everything about the AI, but we can develop spaces where we can interact and we can negotiate responses to each other that make some kind of sense. Another thing I'm going to bring in is the idea of gradual evolution, because it's very easy to see AI systems from the outside and think they're horrendously complex and they're also perfect and magical. And this is a similar discussion to understanding how evolution can create these wonderfully complex eyes that we all carry around inside our heads. But if you see it as a series of stages, it becomes a lot more tractable. So to bring this back to musicking and music technology, this is a noise gate. It has a very simple job in the studio. It's trying to make sure only the signals that you want get through. And the basic noise gate works with a threshold. If the signal is lower than the threshold, it gets cut off. And this is something that is on almost every record you've ever heard, because it gets rid of hum and hiss and all of the background artifacts of recording. And there's various different ways to do it, but it's very simple and it's very clear. If we make something a little bit more complex, this is a plugin that I'm working with. It says, actually, when I'm improvising, I want to have a certain amount of stuff come through. I'm not worried how loud it is, but I want to make sure that I'm not overplaying. And this gets particularly useful when you're playing in complex situations with lots of technology and no one quite knows what's going on. But it's a shift from a physical property to something that feels a bit more musical. I want a certain density of material to come through. And this kind of concept you can expand. There's a piece written by my collaborator Owen Green where there's an algorithm that sits in the middle of three of us playing on our laptops. And if it decides that one of us is making a lot of noise but not doing a lot of physical movement, then it'll cut our sound off. And so that gets into kind of distributed systems, and it gets a little bit more into a sense of musicality and balance. And it then leads into things. This is a photo from our performance last year of saying, well, okay, let's think about what would happen if we could control sound based on, is it interesting? And that gets you into questions of what interesting is. In this case, we're using quite a mathematical definition of interesting, but it means we can start to line up how people hear music with how machines hear music and look at the differences and use them creatively. So that's kind of a gradiated set of things that start becoming more and more intelligent, but they start from places that are much more tractable and understandable. So let's have a look at some different kinds of relationships, or really ways of seeing AI. One of them is it embodies knowledge. And I use this photo because the way an orchestra sets up already embodies a huge amount of knowledge. If you look at the musical instruments we have, there's a lot of ideas about harmony and tonality that are embodied in the way the keys are on a piano keyboard. And you can see them coming out differently on an accordion keyboard. It's a slightly different conception of how physical gesture relates to harmonic structures. And in the same way, if you look at things like, this is tidal cycles and the photos from an algo rave. So this is creating music by live coding. I wouldn't say it's AI, but it's definitely a complex system, and it gets to the point where you don't know exactly what's going to happen when you do things, but you have some ideas. So it gets that sense of animacy. But here the language encodes a lot of ideas about how music's structured and how it's played and how people relate to it. This is a little snippet from a compositional system called Slippery Chicken by Michael Edwards. And he was very clear that when he was making it, he started out trying to encapsulate his personal composition techniques. And it's very interesting because he would bring them in as rules. This is not probabilistic artificial intelligence. This is very much rule-based. And that means that people can reflect about what they do and try and encode that in the computer. Another probably the seminal example here is George Lewis's Voyager, which really came out in the late 80s but carried on development for the next 20 years. And he was very much trying to encode his improvisational strategies in the machine in various ways and get it to come up with things that felt true to the way he would like to see improvisation. But the really interesting thing for me is this quote from him, that it means he doesn't have to worry about composition versus improvisation, because that's a particular human distinction, and the computers have a very different set of distinctions. So by engaging with AI here, we rethink how we understand these technologies and our relations to them. Another viewpoint is that AI can capture spirit. So David Cope produced a system that would churn out lots and lots of stuff that sounded very much like Bach. And there's this idea that, you know, he had pressed a button, he came back from getting a sandwich, and it had produced 5,000 original Bach chorales. But for him, he was doing that because he wanted to understand what style was and what was particular and interesting about Bach. And we can see this coming through now. This is the OpenAI Jukebox project. They can generate music that sounds quite like Frank Sinatra through a slightly nightmare Christmas lens. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the development and you listen to it, this has transformed in the last 6 months and gotten far more plausible. And it leads into the idea of all these deep fakes. This is a vocal synthesis piece. I'll play you the first little bit.
I'm the very model of a modern major general of information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England, and I quote the fights historical from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical. So for me, that's really interesting because it's completely captured Biggie's style and his flow. And so the creative possibilities of using a tool like that are amazing, but it also brings up issues around appropriation. Biggie is, of course, a person of color, and when material goes out and people can fake it and they can capture aspects of that, that raises critical issues as well as creative possibilities. Another view is that AI is really a terrain to explore. And just as we saw with things like Mandelbrot sets and with cellular automata, you come up with these mathematical systems and you explore different configurations. And you see this in Mario Klingerman's work where he talks a lot about trying to capture the interesting moments and those magical spaces. So he's out there exploring the latent spaces to find interesting things. I'm talking a little bit faster because I'm nearly at the end, but AI can be very good at translating between different things. So this comes back to Jake Elwes' closed loop work, where one AI generates images that match captions, another tries to caption those images, and that continual mistranslation and the glitches that come with it is a really creatively interesting space. But it's also the thing where if we want to work with complex multi-dimensional controllers, we might need AI in the middle to transform what we're doing. So it leads into the idea that of AI assemblages. We get impulses from the machines, we do our playing, we do whatever interaction we have with the hardware, the sound making and the processing that happens. And there's ways that AI can come in and machine intelligences can come in at all levels of that and can shape what we do without getting in the way of us being creative as humans. So really there's a lot of ways to put people and algorithms together, extending abilities, being prostheses, encoding knowledge, and creativity can find its way into all sorts of places there. But what's important is learning to navigate these relationships between the humans and the technologies. Thanks very much.
Dave, thanks a lot for your great talk, and also thanks a lot for bringing all these incredible examples. They make it really vivid to us how technology and humans can interact, and I really hope that we can come back to some of the examples and many of the things you talked about later during our discussion. Our next panelists are coming from Berlin. Roman Lipski is a Polish-born painter who has lived and worked in Berlin since 1989 and has been exhibited in museums like the Nagoya Boston Museum of Fine Arts in Japan, the National Art Museum of China, the Elgis Museum of Contemporary Art in Istanbul, Mark's Collection at Hamburger Bahnhof, the Alex Katz Foundation in New York, and so on. His present project, Unfinished, is being developed in collaboration with YQP and Birds on Mars. And Unfinished is the first artificial muse for artists. And that brings us right to Florian Domann, our second panelist, because he's co-founder and chief creative of Birds on Mars, a creative garden for the exploration of in-betweens of artificial, organizational, and human intelligence. Florian is a computer scientist, machine learner, IBM disciple, guest lecturer at various universities, and part of the Berlin entrepreneur network Catapult Now. He's part of the artist collective YQP NYC Berlin, and in their artistic work they explore the human value in our digital world and merge technology with interactive storytelling. So, Roman and Florian, we're really excited to see you guys. And I think from what I saw before, we see mainly your heads floating in space.
Hallo Welt.
Guten Morgen.
Sehr schön hier zu sein und wir befinden uns hier gerade in so einem Art Musenuniversum. Und, kleinen Moment, wir befinden uns hier gerade in einer Art kleinen Musenuniversum und unser Titel heute ist Post-AI und Beyond Routine zusammen mit Roman Lipski
Und Florian Domann.
Wir sitzen gerade in Berlin-Schöneberg, senden aber in die ganze Welt und möchten heute über das Leben ohne Muse sprechen, obwohl wir uns gerade in dem Musenuniversum befinden. Und ich möchte gerne starten mit einem kleinen Zitat. Dafür muss ich nur noch klicken können. Ich möchte starten mit einem kleinen Zitat. Ich habe Roman vor 2 Wochen mal wieder getroffen und Roman sagte zu mir, I currently paint without a muse because without a muse I'm where I never would have been without a muse.
Habe ich das wirklich gesagt? Und auf Englisch?
Nee, in dem Fall auf Deutsch und heute können wir auch glücklicherweise auf Deutsch sprechen, weil die KI ja im Hintergrund übersetzt. Da steckt vieles drin, wirkt erstmal ein bisschen verwirrend. Im Wesentlichen soll es aber sagen, dass die Zusammenarbeit mit der künstlich intelligenten Muse, wie wir sie nun vor über 4 Jahren getauft haben, immer noch wirkt, auch wenn man vielleicht zwischendurch nicht aktiv mit der Muse zusammenarbeitet. Und wir möchten jetzt mal so einen kleinen Überflug geben über die letzten paar Jahre und vor allem darüber reden, wo wir heute stehen und wie es in der Zukunft weitergeht. Und der eine oder die andere, die vielleicht das Projekt kennen, wissen, dass alles in dieser unendlichen Geschichte, die wir hier gerade zusammen gehen, mit diesem Bild begann, also eine Schwarz-Weiß-Fotografie, die der Ausgangspunkt war für all das, was später entstanden ist. Und das Spannende ist, in der Zusammenarbeit von Roman und der künstlich intelligenten Muse eben vor allem, dass die Muse eine unendliche Vielfalt an Bildern generieren kann, was man hier mal an einem Beispiel sieht und vor allem auch hier im Hintergrund sich anschauen kann, die unendlichen Möglichkeiten zu generieren, Kombinationen, neue Farbwelten zu erzeugen und letztlich etwas zu generieren, was Roman vor allem als Inspiration dienen soll. Und das Ganze hat sich mittlerweile immer weiterentwickelt, führte unter anderem dazu, dass nicht nur viele, viele Bilder entstanden sind, sondern auch neue Werkzeuge. Hier sieht man mal eins dieser Werkzeuge, wo Roman jetzt die Möglichkeit hat, über eine Kamera, die man hier sieht, Objekte, die er selbst baut, aufzunehmen und dann letztlich in Malerei zu überführen, die ihm dann schlussendlich als Inspiration dient. Und da gibt es viele, viele weitere Werkzeuge und Tools, die auf dieser Reise entstanden sind. Und ein ganz besonderer Moment war letztes Jahr, ziemlich genau letztes Jahr beim Beyond Festival, wo wir zusammen auf der Bühne standen und auch da ist wieder etwas Neues entstanden.
Beyond, we love you. Tatsächlich, vor einem Jahr Beyond, eine wunderbare Bühne, die wir zur Verfügung bekommen haben. Und wir beide, klassisch standen wir auf der Bühne und sprachen wir unsere Präsentation. Und da wir eine tolle Möglichkeit bekommen haben, uns mit den Bildern auf die Bühne zu stellen, dachte ich, 3 Bilder schaffe ich alleine nicht. Deswegen, Florian, lass uns mal zusammen malen. Du hast glücklicherweise zugesagt. Das war fantastisch. Das war für mich ein Schlüsselerlebnis, weil wir dann am Ende mehrere wunderbare Bilder hatten, in einer Qualität, die ich vorher nicht, also in einem Stil, was nicht meins war, aber es war gigantisch, es war erfrischend. Und ja, was passierte dann in diesem Moment? Also es gab schon in der Kunstgeschichte verschiedene Anstellungen, was Kunst und Künstler angeht, zum Beispiel La Art pour la Art, wo Kunst auch ohne den Zuschauer auskommen sollte. Neulich habe ich gehört, dass es Kunstwerke entstehen sollen, die ohne Künstler. Ja, ist das richtig? Weiß ich auch nicht, aber sehr stark und sehr interessant, neue Positionen, die aber nicht wirklich unsere sind. Was ich damals mir gedacht habe, was Florian auch bestätigt, ist eben kooperative Kreativität. Und natürlich auch Interdisziplinarität, denn es ist fantastisch, es ist erfrischend, wenn ein Maler, ein Künstler zusammen mit jemandem kreativ ist und was Tolles macht, der nicht aus der künstlerischen Szene kommt. Florian in diesem Fall ja, aber inzwischen praktiziere ich das auch so als so eine Art Zusammenarbeit mit vielen Leuten aus verschiedenen Bereichen. Und das ist die Entwicklung, das ist die logische und natürliche Entwicklung der Muse oder des Projektes anfängt. Hier geht es natürlich wie immer, wie ich schon damals gesagt habe, egal wie die Maschinen wunderbar sind, der Mensch steht in der Mitte, hier ist das Gleiche. Die Muse ist überall da, die ist omnipotent, die künstlich intelligente Muse meine ich hier. Und der Mensch ist immer noch in der Mitte, aber sein Wirken wird verstärkt auch durch die künstliche Intelligenz, durch die AI Muse. Anfänglich ist ein Konzept, es lebt, es entwickelt sich dann weiter und so eben hier ein paar Beispiele, wie so eine Kooperation aussehen kann. Auf der linken Seite kann man ein Bild sehen, was jemand gemalt hat, der dachte ja auch, bevor er zu mir kam, er ist nicht kreativ, er kann nicht malen und hat irgendwie Angst, das eigene Potenzial zu entwickeln. Nun auf der rechten Seite das Bild ergänzt mit meiner Kreativität, mit meinem künstlerischen Ansatz, sieht ganz anderes aus. Also das bedeutet jetzt für mich, dass jeder Mensch ist kreativ, hat dieses kreatives Potenzial. Die Sache ist, wie können wir das wieder beleben? Wie können wir wieder den anderen Menschen daran erinnern, dass die Kreativität Kreativität auch in jedem steckt. Hier hilft uns natürlich die Muse. Die Muse ist immer da, die steht immer zur Hilfe, wenn wir die Hilfe natürlich brauchen. Aber es passiert ein Wunder und jetzt wird es spannend, denn das Projekt Unfinished zeigt mir und auch anderen dann, dass nicht nur die Muse inspirieren kann, sondern der Mensch, der sich kreativ zeigt, auch eine riesen Inspirationsquelle für mich ist.
Und ich glaube, das ist etwas, was enorm wichtig ist. Wir haben selber viel in den letzten Jahren darüber gesprochen, was neue Formen der Zusammenarbeit bedeutet. Und ich habe es mal versucht, so zusammenzufassen, dieser Gedanke einer Superintelligenz, es eher weiterzuentwickeln und neu zu denken, eher in Richtung unglaublicher Intelligenzen. Ja? Und unglaubliche Intelligenzen bedeutet nicht die Superintelligenz, wie sie in den Science-Fiction und in der sonstigen Literatur diskutiert wird, sondern unglaubliche Intelligenz meint eben, menschliche Intelligenz trifft künstliche Intelligenz, Menschen kommen auf neue Art und Weise zusammen und es entsteht eine neue Interdisziplinarität und so auch eine Art neue Definition des Wirs und des Uns, wo wir gerade aus meiner Sicht noch total am Anfang stehen und jetzt auch gerade mit unserem Projekt Unfinished wieder einen Schritt weitergehen und diese neuen Formen der Zusammenarbeiten neu ausloten. Ist ja heute nur ein kurzer Impuls und vor allem geht es gleich im Panel dann nochmal weiter. Unsere Zeit ist auch vorbei. Was ich noch mitgeben möchte ist, wer daran interessiert ist, auch mehr darüber zu erfahren, wie Roman aktuell mit anderen Leuten zusammen malt und Neues schafft und das Konzept Unfinished nochmal auf ein neues Level bringt, sieht er auch weitere Bilder auf seiner Website. Und gleichzeitig, wer daran interessiert ist, noch mehr über die Muse und die ganze Geschichte zu erfahren, kann das hier auch unter der Domain checken. Und was wir bei Birds gerade aktuell auch im Geiste unseres gemeinsamen Projektes weiterdenken in Richtung Musik, mit der Band Maus und Mars, unter anderem das Ganze mehr in Richtung auch anderer Kreativbereiche weiterdenken. Und ansonsten freuen wir uns gleich aufs Panel, oder?
Auf jeden Fall.
Und verabschieden uns aus unserem kleinen virtuellen Wohnzimmer und freuen uns auf die nächsten Sessions.
Tschüss.
Ciao.
Thank you very much, Florian and Roman. And what I really thought was interesting, because their green screen sometimes let us see through their eyes into the back. Ludger, you've been working on the Beyond Festival and with the Beyond Festival as a tool for collaboration, for interdisciplinarity for many, many years now. How many years is it? 12?
Since 2010 we started, and 2011 was our first festival.
How would you think the world around us has changed in that time? I mean, we're not talking about Corona and Trump, but I mean in terms of disciplinarity. Is you always, and the Beyond Festival was always very strong for bringing people from all different parts, tech, science, arts together. Has that been reflected in, for example, the universities around us?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of really changes. When we started with future design, we were kind of very, very sure that we can rock it. Yeah? We have all the knowledge, we have all the money, we have all the technology to make a real beautiful world, what I call desirable unprobabilities. And then in the last 10 years, since we work on future design, the parameters around the globe has changed in a way I was never expecting it. Yeah, we have fascism back, we have nationalism back, we have populism back. And all those things, we have everything on the table, but there is not a political will to really do it. This is one of the things. The other thing is when we started to bring together art with science and new technology, it was like a pink elephant in the room. And nobody took this serious. And in the last years, especially scientists are approaching us all the time. We had now in China a huge exhibition at the National Museum in Beijing, and a lot of conferences, and now the scientists come really to us and said, you have to help us to transmit our knowledge to the society, because they are reacting, and we see that all with the fake news. A lot of political decisions are made by emotions and not by facts. And as you said, we are storytellers, and this is always the dramaturgy from the Beyond Festival, is that I try to bring different pieces and people together which normally don't meet, because we need a systemic and an integrative approach to those questions. I recently started also to invite people from economists, and I needed to kind of get my mind into those thinkings, because without the business we will not be able to make the changes necessary. Yeah, but I think in this way we're going further, and the most important thing, and you will see it in every kind of Beyond, there's a dramaturgy getting up to by the end. Last year we called it post-capitalism, this year we called it new narratives for the 21st century. We need to get into new stories, and there's something I think that's really important, that the religions we know today, they are stories from peasant and shepherds. And the political systems we know, like liberalism, communism, socialism, are stories from the first industrial revolution. And those stories don't help us when it comes to the new digital world. Yeah? When we see the sign of the communists with the hammer and the sichel, I don't know the English term, then we see that those symbols cannot explain how we work with artificial intelligence. And if you read the Bible or the Quran, you get some tips how you can have sex with your slaves, but not how you can have sex with robots. Yeah. So I think those, and there are not really new narratives showing up. We have two narratives which kind of seems to formulate. The one is the Silicon Valley narrative, where super rich people want to become superhumans. They want to change their brain, their DNA, and if you have billions, you can do that. They want to have eternal life, which I find really boring. But this narrative doesn't include us, and it especially doesn't include the children of Nigeria. And there's another narrative coming up, which I called the expert narrative. It's mostly an Asian narrative, where we have a perfect state by complete control that everybody is doing the right thing for society. So the first narrative has completely freedom without any social responsibility. And to simplify it, the second narrative has complete social responsibility with no personal freedom. And I think here in Europe, we cannot agree with both of those narratives. But where is our narrative? Where is a narrative where we combine social responsibility and freedom, and where we can get over the antagonism of nature and technology? And we always think, because those old narratives told us that nature and technology are antagonistic because our technology now was always at the cost of planetary resources. But there's no biological or physical need for that. Yeah? Ants are much more than us. They have they cycle more materials and energy, and there's no nuclear waste by the end, and no plastic bags in the sea. Yeah? So we are not too much. We are still too stupid. And this is what we try to do, to find pieces and put them together to create a new narrative. And as you said, stories are driving the world.
Now, of course, we love it when artists and storytellers help to deliver the good message, right? The libertarian one, the one that we all share. But our enemies, if I might say so, are also using storytelling and also using emotions and emotions instead of facts. I mean, look at the Trump government. To deliver or to reach people's hearts instead of their heads. So coming back to the two authors that I mentioned before, Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling, where do you think, or when do you think it is important to rely on data rather than on emotionalization, and when is it okay to emotionalize?
Well, the thing is, we first need to have the most clear vision of what is reality, and then try to transform those ideas of how we perceive the world and what are the facts we know, and then bring them into a narrative. And what is so important in the whole concept of future design is a narrative where we imagine something where we want to be. Future design is about discussing the future, and this is normally a job for politics. Yeah? But the politics are just kind of switching in between different crisis modes, and they don't formulate a vision for the future. So I think that is where artists have to jump in.
Okay, and I think we should invite our next panelist to join the discussion, and it is Refik Anadol. He's born in Istanbul and works as a media artist, a director, and pioneer in the aesthetics of machine intelligence. His body of work locates creativity at the intersection of humans and machines. And he's going to introduce one of his projects as well to us, Space in the Mind of a Machine. And this project works by taking the data that flows around us in the neural network of a computerized mind as his collaborator. And Refik paints with a thinking brush, offering radical visualizations of our digitized memories and expanding the possibilities of architecture, narrative, and the body in motion. And later, as Ludger managed before, we also are going to see quite a long art presentation by Refik at the end of our talk. But now I give you Refik Anadol.
Hello everyone, can you see me, hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So hello from Los Angeles. It's almost 2 a.m., but I'm happy to be there virtually. May I share my screen for a keynote? Or just can I just share my thoughts? Happy to, both of them is possible. can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. So again, great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I think today I will very quickly, very briefly, like to share some ideas behind the work, and also why I think I'm interested in the specific field of imagination. So as William Gibson said, I was very inspired by the idea of colliding digital and physical worlds. And I think specifically, I was very inspired back in my early years when I watched Blade Runner, the movie changed my life. And I started using computation in my life, I think since 8 years old. And and basically, I think I'm very inspired by how technology is changing as who we are as society, and actually how we are becoming new entities that machines are becoming our, or we are becoming machines controlled thinking. And also, I'm especially very inspired by the idea of this sense of displacement, like being don't know exactly where we are in a physical or virtual world. And I think the more I think about the art as a whole and how it's just contextualized in the 21st century and how technology is transforming what it is, eventually I think, as John Maeda said before, design is a solution to a problem, art is a question to a problem. And I think for me the problem, or for me the question was, what does it really mean to be a human in 21st century? I think to answer this question, of course, there's so many things to say, but today I would like to share specific research that is going on almost like 4 years. I was very fortunate as an artist working with data and computation last almost 11 years. I was able to work with one of the best engineers in the field of artificial intelligence. In 2016, I was invited by Google's AMI, which is a special program designed for collaborating with philosophers and artists and collaborating with one of the pioneer AI engineers and try to make artist dreams happen. And for me, the question was very obvious. Like, can I paint with a thinking brush? Like, can I dip my brush into mind of a machine and paint with a machine consciousness? Of course, I was not able to do it by myself as a self-learned visual programmer. And this is Mike Taika, who was my mentor. And I learned how to use AI in my work almost 4 years ago. Especially in my work, I'm especially inspired by the idea of, as a human beings, our cognitive capacity of imagination, but also heavily inspired by how information turns into knowledge and eventually becomes wisdom, and how we can actually speculate the idea of consciousness from the lens of a machine. And to make this happen very early, 2017, explore the Library of Babel, the story that really inspired me, also work on many research, especially about the mental model, but also create a project called Archive Dreaming, which was one of the first example of using AI in a public space. And later on, I was super inspired by the idea of archives, which I believe they are humanity's memories, hoping they're the truth factors of who we are, where we are coming from. And I love the idea of remembering the future. So I eventually enjoyed these neural networks and how they creating this context. But I wasn't inspired by the technology itself, but I was inspired by how machine has this incredible potential of expanding the power of expanding the power of mind. And basically it can recognize images and an incredible fast way, but also it stores data in a place called latent space. Latent space is a concept, it's a mathematical understanding of space from the machine's perspective. It's an n-dimensional environment where a machine can store information. But as an artist, which I'm not computer science, I'm not a mathematician, I was deeply inspired by the idea of how we can take this space and transform into a narrative. And I think since 4 years, I'm really understanding how big data, how big corpus of information, especially collective memories, and how we can detach ego from data, and how we can work with collective memories and transform them into dreams, especially machine hallucinations. I'm very inspired by lower dimension algorithms, specifically allowing us to transform these millions of images or data points into understandable 3 dimensions, Cartesian space. But I'm also very inspired how to contextualize kind of a sculptures and AI data sculptures. And heavily inspired by also specific algorithm called generative adversarial networks, which is a specific domain of machine learning algorithms, a deep learning technique that allows machine to look enormous amount of information. And as a result, two neural network, discriminator and generator, look at the information and try to fool each other by the truth or the not truth. And at the end, you can discover a new universe. And I am trying to understand how machine can be used to recreate a context of dream or hallucination. And this goes in many scale, but especially today, I'm really very inspired by several projects But starting from this, especially GAN algorithms are really like transforming how we understand like who we are, like as our faces. NVIDIA friends really allowed me and my team to deep dive into these algorithms, also work with one of the most cutting edge technology and hardware and software. I was very inspired by this specific algorithm, which was used to create almost realistic human faces. But for me, it wasn't inspiring to like create a new human face, but I was very inspired the idea of what will happen if you take this powerful tool and reinterpret collective memories. So I started the project called Mission Hallucinations, and I'm very like my projects were like very humble and going back to like the spaces that I'm inspired, like as a media artist working with space. I was always like thinking about like how a space can have this intelligence, like what will happen if a building can learn, like can it dream. But to make these questions happen, I just deep dive into the archives of like culture and generations of like many generations of like different architecture. But at the end, we developed a custom software which allows me, literally, using a joystick on the left side, you are watching that I am flying in the mind of a machine and trying to understand 1024 dimensions. But while understanding on the right side, I was able to create this kind of a cinematic experience. But the difference was I was able to create a reason of movement, a non-linear reason of movement without any cliche cinematographic experience of fade in, fade out, cross-dissolve, or jump cut. This is like a fluid consciousness, and literally machine's mind is melting each other, literally melting time and space, like using like a past, now, and future at the same time. So this project was really one of, I think, as a studio, by the way, I'm not alone. As a studio, we are 12 people. We can speak 12 language. Our median age is 25. And we are like AI engineers, data scientists, philosophers, anthropologists, neuroscientists, architects, and designers. So we are like trying to understand how we can reinterpret humans consciousness through the lens of machine consciousness. And these are like these experiments using big data set of like, for example, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Tadao Ando, and many other heroes. But also not only that, also looking for the machines memories, specifically machines that are collecting our, I mean, most likely our next home, like Mars or ISS, which is our Earth's best camera, or Hubble telescope, which is recording the entire galaxy. So what I want to say is that the research is really diverse, but we are not only just focusing on two-dimensional representations, we are trying to understand how we can narrate this three-dimensional environment or n-dimensional environment in which capacity, and really looking every single day new ways of understanding this universe. So basically, I think what I'm trying to say is the AI is an incredibly powerful tool, and like artists like me, a first generation AI artist who is trying to understand what else we can do with that, I am less interested in ramifications or just spending time with negative speculations. I found myself much inspired by what else we can do with that and how we can touch this idea beyond just like words or just speculations. So that's the reason I found myself and my team constantly understanding what will happen if AI one day can reach 113 million images of a city such as New York. So the images you are seeing are not real; they are completely machine created. But once we have these enormous data sets, and once we erase humans from data sets, once we have only left the collective memories of an environment such as urban space, like buildings, nature, and many things, at the end, we found out that the machine can reconstruct collective memories much better than personal, egocentric experiences. So, what I'm trying to say is how we can create a new narrative, how we can create a new narrative that can take this machine consciousness and reinterpret cinema, reinterpret architecture, and give literally consciousness or memories to the space that we inhabit. So it's a speculation. I'm on a journey. I don't know where we'll go, but I'm happy to say that with the quantum computation, specifically AI models will be living, and that is coming like in a couple of years later, and that will be like a very fun things happening. And I feel like AI is like anything like a fire, a simple technology for humanity. It's just incredibly important for us. So what we do with that, it's up to us. And I'm in the optimist side. I'm in the optimist side, try to ask the best questions to enhance how we learn, remember, and dream. I think that's kind of like my take on how to use machine intelligence in my work. Thank you very much. And I think you will be also watching Machine Hallucinations. Nature Dreams, which is speculating using 68 million nature photography, and we let our AI to learn from enormous amount of images of nature. And you will be watching, I think, one of the most biggest data set ever collected without human and egocentric information, and letting AI to create almost realistic landscapes. Hope you enjoy, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Refik, for this great introduction into your work and also your way of thinking. And I think we are ready to start the panel now. Let's hope that technology will work. Looking good so far. Can you guys see each other as well? I hope so. You're nodding. Okay. Well, I took so many notes during your presentations, so I have so many questions, Ludger. I guess you have many questions as well.
It's your turn.
Maybe let me start. And let me start with the first question to Refik. During your talk, at one moment you said, the machine's mind. And my question to you is, will there be a creative artificial general intelligence in the future? An artificial intelligence that is so smart and so creative that it actually can take agency for its own creative decisions? Because so far what we see is machines imitating creativity. Will that change in the future? What's your guess?
Absolutely, yes. It will happen, but to proving this is like not that easy by the words, and we need the action to see that. But I believe that the machine decisions will be something very important for ethics and society very soon. The question I think here, I'm asking this question to myself too. Like, if one day machine decides to create a culture, and in that culture decides to create art, I will absolutely accept it as an entity, as a living entity. But again, it's a very personal take. I'm not sure what society will do, but I believe that I think whatever we can do simply, eventually, I think, without talking about free will, we will have a lot of similarities with the machine's mind. And that will take some time to really, achieve literally perfection. But the attempt will eventually come, I think, especially after quantum computation. This is pretty doable. And I think it won't be a big surprise.
You mentioned the word co-creation a few times. Now, when we talk about the co-creation between humans and machines, the co-creation between things and human beings, where can we learn that? I mean, you guys obviously have your scientific resources at universities, at your institutions, but where can ordinary people like I learn to collaborate with machines? In schools, maybe? In universities? What other places?
I think the really very quick ways, like literally internet. I'm also like self-taught, explorer, let's say. I learned to learn when I was very young, I guess, and I applied the same model to like many things in the internet. And right now, just available code is incredibly rich. But I think the other good news is like there are tools called Runway ML, or like some platforms allows you to like even writing a one single line of code, you can train your own model in the cloud without any hesitation. Like there are some incredible resources at the moment that allows many young minds or any minds who wants to understand this technology in a high level to achieve some certain amount of machine intelligence.
That brings me to Matthias Röder. Matthias, you told me once that Herbert von Karajan was extremely keen on teaching young people on how to conduct, how to work with music. And where do you see today's young musicians? what kind of resources do they have at the moment to work with machines, to learn collaboration in music between musician and the machine? Do you offer something like that?
Well, you know, it's a very important question, and that goes to the heart of how we actually educate young musicians. And if you look at most music universities in the German-speaking world, they select, you know, students based on ability on their respective instrument. So if you can already play your instrument well, you know, you have a good chance of getting in. But that leaves out, of course, a huge portion of what makes one an interesting artist, or let alone a successful artist. And part of that is being entrepreneurial in spirit. And I don't mean this necessarily only in a commercial sense, but also being an entrepreneur means being open-minded, being alert, and trying to understand what is happening in the world at large. And I think these are super important characteristics. And I think we should be selecting students for music universities also in part based on these characteristics. Now, that's something that if you don't have it yet, you can definitely learn it. And what we try to embrace at the Karajan Institute is a culture of sharing knowledge and exploring. We were, I think, the first to do a classical music hackathon. This was 8 or 9 years ago, where we invited technologists, musicians, artists, anyone who was interested to collaborate, to learn from one another, and to develop this kind of spirit. And I think this is something, Refik mentioned this earlier as well. You can learn so much from the internet. You know, you can learn so much from chat rooms. I myself taught myself programming and Linux and all of that using internet relay chat. You know, the dinosaurs amongst us will know what this is. Today you have Slack, you have so many possibilities. Just be open-minded, and sometimes it's good not to listen too much to what your professor says.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And Dave, this is a question for you. During your presentation, I actually only understood half of what you said. And so the question was, or the question is, how can we help society understand better what the advances in technology at the moment are? How can artists, but also scientists, translate their work better into every people's understanding, also into everybody's language?
That's a lovely question, because it's very close to my heart. I'm working with a group at the moment called Experiential AI, and the mission of that group is to try and understand how creative practice around AI can help both to communicate what's happening in AI and to change the way that AI practitioners think about what they do. So if you look at works like Jake Elwes's Zizi, it's generating faces, but it's exploring the role of the data set by looking at queer and drag performers. So it's trying to make sense of the implications of these things for gender and identity. If you look at Anna Riddler's Tulip Bloom, you see really strongly the idea that all of these points in the data set come from the real world, and that they represent something. So there's a big role for the arts in kind of making sense of how the technology is and what it's doing at the moment, and making that experiential. So I think it's important to not just tell people things, but to allow the last bit of space for them to generate their own understanding and to take things a little bit viscerally. And I think that's where creative practice is incredibly powerful. And then exactly as Matthias and Refik have been saying, having systems where that make it easy for people to engage with these technologies is absolutely crucial. Giving these easy ways in, making these tools what I would call at hand.
So it doesn't feel particularly odd to pick up an algorithm and do something with it. And part of that is figuring out the right stories to tell around them, the right ways to conceive of them, that help us understand the high level of the way they work without diving deep into the complexities.
Thank you very much. And Ludger, I think we have a question for all our viewers, right?
Well, we have not a question, but we want you to ask questions to us. If you want to have any questions to one of our speakers or to us regarding this issue, you can use the social media to send us those questions, and we will try to answer as good as possible.
Yeah. So don't hesitate, be brave, ask your questions to everybody that is on the panel right now, and then we'll try to answer them. Now, during some of the talks, we mentioned tech companies, or we mentioned, big companies. Matthias, for example, mentioned Deutsche Telekom, who helped him with his project on finishing Beethoven piece. Then we've heard about Google. I think it was Refik talking about. So my question to actually all of you guys, but mainly we can start with Matthias and then Refik, is what is the role of tech companies these days? Obviously, in former times, you always had companies being sponsors for art. But in this case, tech companies provide not only tools, but they seem to build a whole ecosystem that is evolving around technology and that can be used by artists. What does that mean for the role of the companies themselves? Matthias, maybe you can start.
So it's an interesting question. So I'd say they are first and foremost enablers today, and they also push the boundary oftentimes of what is possible. And this is of course a big oversimplification, but I think when you look at the industrial age, which we are now leaving behind, you had a separation between the innovator and the person who actually is active in the marketplace. And that has changed with tech. That has changed tremendously because now the people who are the innovators are also the ones who are the first movers in the market in many cases. So I see the big tech companies as enablers and those who are pushing the boundaries. And it's interesting for me to see how they are collaborating with artists, with technologists around the globe, with people like you and I, to make that happen.
Thank you, Matthias. Refik, what's your point of view on that? I think you mentioned Google before.
Yes, it's a great question. I mean, I was at my first year and second my grad studies at UCLA, studying with Casey Rias and Christian Moller and Jennifer Steinkamp, and I was very fortunate to get my first award from Microsoft Research. It was an incredibly large amount of research fund, and also the same in 2 years I became a collector. Sorry, Bill Gates became my collector almost in 2 years, and literally, very funny. I mean, once I think the technology, because of Los Angeles, first of all, I'm very close to the Silicon Valley. So the imagination and the art context is very much inspired by the light and space art, maybe, but also like truly the technology itself, where it comes from. And Google for me was just like a coincidence. They were looking for artists to just collaborate, and it was the very first attempt. And for me, it was a big reward because there was no way for me to understand what AI means in the context of hardware and software, and I had no chance to compute this data or go like beyond my own like limited capacity of technology or imagination. So that was an incredible for me. And for them, what they learned is, I guess, how they can push their own ethics and the ideas beyond just making a product. And I think there, I mean, you can find a lot of research-based ideas in like NVIDIA, Google, Intel, IBM, Microsoft. They are all heavily research-based, I think, entities. And what I found myself is always in the research domain, never like in close to these like boring products or like, capitalist expectation of how to sell something, whatever. Like it was just always I found myself like where the ideas coming from, or where the very first simply touching an algorithm or hardware before they become a product moment, let's say. And I mean, right now we are talking with DeepMind people, for example, like, I mean, working with like, I mean, Intel, NVIDIA, IBM at the same time, or like, it's just so interesting. And very openly saying, I couldn't find any open-minded institutions so far. No offense to like, I mean, certain art world, but I couldn't find the same openness, very openly saying that in the same territory that, I mean, or a territory that has been there for many centuries. So what I want to say is, if that collaboration opens my mind, most likely it's also opening the entity's minds, and I think there's a symbiotic relationship here. So it's not just like, here's a funding, here's a cloud computing credits too. It's not like that. So that dialogue between an artist and the entity, I think where the serendipity is mostly arrives. And I personally find myself similar to, I think, most likely in Renaissance, right? Getting the best pigment, best brush, and the most beautiful empty canvas is not so different than getting the best algorithm, state of the art hardware, and try to imagine a context and discourse of a certain art journey. So I think there's so much correlations here. I'm just, in my humble opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question to Lutger here. Lutger, let's slip into creativity a bit and talk about it. Can you give us your definition of what is creativity?
Well, we haven't discussed it yesterday on a bar. Well, I think there are different phases in creativity. We don't know what it exactly is, but we have some idea. The first thing is you need an incredible amount of input into your brain, and it should be as wide and open as possible. So specialists are having heavy times to be creative. The more different information you get from all sides, then your brain starts to work by itself. It makes connections. It makes new synapses. It tries to combine things, building patterns. And 99% of all those connections are simply bullshit. Yeah, they doesn't make sense. But when you are able, and this is that you need a moment where you do really nothing but try to watch your brain working. And then you see all those different bullshit things, and then once in a while, there's this eureka moment. Your brain is connecting things which had never been connected before, and when you realize that, then you go like, whoa, this is interesting. Yeah? And then you have, of course, go back to normal to do research and work on that. But I think do nothing is very, very important for being creative. And we lost this idea. I always try to tell my students, take one day where you really do nothing but just look into the clouds, or go into a jacuzzi, or watch your brain working. And it doesn't mean don't go gaming, don't look at your iPhone, because then you cannot see what your brain is doing. And one thing which brings me to a question, and I want to start with Roman and Flo. We have, all those artists made a lot of experience how they can creatively work with artificial intelligence, construct those artificial intelligence, train them to be inspirational, to be transformative. But what would be your experience if we need artificial intelligence for real problem solving? So what should be the interaction of artificial intelligence for problem solving, for example, to climate change, in relation to the human impact, the human-machine collaboration? And this I would like to start with Roman and Flo, and then see if we kind of get there, our creative experience working with artificial intelligence, to the next panel in the afternoon, and kind of bridge it.
Okay, I just heard that Roman and Flo, the floating heads, sort of lost connection. Okay. So maybe we can ask them that question later. But we have a so-called Zuschauerfrage here, a question that came in via social media. And the question is, how important do you think is the open science community for the development of the great things you have created? And I think that question goes out to all of you guys, but maybe Dave, you'd be the first one to answer that. So how important is the open science community for your work?
I can certainly pile in there. I mean, firstly, open science is fundamentally important, not just to me. It's one of the greatest things that humanity does, the creation and sharing of knowledge in those ways.
I think, and this goes back a little bit to the question about big corporations earlier. I've been pleasantly surprised by how open a lot of these large groups have been about the work that they've been doing and the happiness to publish algorithms and trained models. And work like that absolutely accelerates the field massively. So I think there's a sense of sharing there, which is quite transformative, not least because the large organizations can do things that no one else can. They can pull in collections of data and processing that are absolutely inaccessible to anyone else. And if that wasn't open, then we'd have a lot more trouble with it. So I think that sense of openness is what allows exciting creative tools to come out. And if you look at things like Google Magenta is starting to emerge as a way to bring machine learning into musicking in a bunch of different ways. And they work very hard to make it accessible and so on. And they publish what's going on and they carry out participatory research. So on that side of things, absolutely, open science is fundamental.
Okay, I have another question. This one going to Refik. And Refik, there was a scene in your talk where you showed a three-dimensional image of churches and cathedrals, through which one could see an interactive. Is it an interactive interface for performances? That is the first question. And maybe you can tell us a bit more about how that interactive interface works.
Yes, happy to. So this algorithm is called StyleGAN, and previously it was a PGGAN from NVIDIA. And I was very obsessed specifically with this algorithm now, almost 3 years, I guess. But the reason I was obsessed is like literally you have a chance to like really manipulate the quality of like interpretation of machine. So in a very high level explanation, you have a truly augmentation of almost 8 neural network layers. So simply, that was one of the inspirations. So we basically created custom software, which I'm calling it latent space browser, which allows you to like use a kind of a joystick, a simple like game joystick, which allows you to like fly XYZ directions, and also allows you to like pick a point in space, which corresponds to in latent space coordinates in the machine's, let's say, findings or the model itself. And then this allows you to like create a narrative, basically, like putting a camera in the mind of a machine. I'm calling it just in a speculation way. So what this allows you is like you can define the details of the dream state. You can put like if it's a building, you can define how much definition on the facades or on like on the corners of the edges or like the doors and like whatever the data set is like included. And then you can really create a narrative with this. So it's a custom made software in Python, heavily using like custom code required, but also have its own like lower dimension reduction approach, which is using a UMAP algorithm on the left side, and mostly using VGG16, another like image recognition algorithm that allows you to like find similarities in the samples of corpus of GAN algorithm. It's a bit complex, but basically taking what machine learned, try to unfold it to create a narrative, basically. And now I'm calling it like a latent cinema tool because literally it's a cinematographic like exploration, but also it can just generate its own random points. So it can be real time, like never ending context. So just like an exploration of that.
Thank you very much, Refik. And that person had actually 2 more questions that are probably too detailed. So maybe you can ask them to Refik directly. I think we have the social media contacts of the speakers online. But Ludger, our friends, the floating heads, Florian and Roman are back. Yeah. So maybe you can repeat your question to them.
Yeah, well, you made a lot of experience with machine-human interaction using the algorithm as an inspiration. When we come to real problem solving, like in climate change, what would be your experience or your advice how we can use, for example, an artificial intelligence as an inspiration for our path towards a desirable future. There will be tomorrow a lecture by Steve Lansing who proposes that, like indigenous tribes, we have a council of elders who have not political power, but that we found an academy of scientists who have the credibility to give advices, not political power. And could we kind of work inspirational also with artificial intelligence, that they would be like a council of machines who give us inspiration and advice and not have political power?
Ludger, can you hear us?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Perfect. Ludger, that was a very long question, by the way, but, but I try my best. So how to use artificial intelligence in the field of climate change and for a better world? I think there are many, many chances. We are just at the beginning of this whole development, and I think it's very important that all of us think about it. That's the first point. Think about it and start to work on it. And I think I can grab out one point that I want to make, how to use it for climate change purposes. What is AI good at? So AI is good at detecting patterns and using that patterns from the past to write something in the future. And I think all of us have to find a way in a world where maybe the past is not the best example for a better future, with what data we want to train the machines to find the visions of a world where we want to live in. And I think this is a point all of us should work on, to find a way to analyze the past with AI, but in a new kind of way. And there comes the inspiration and the human part in. So to use the patterns on the one side, but when we want to analyze the past, to use it for a future we want to live in, we have to bring in something new. I think this is a kind of chance, and on the other side, a kind of challenge, because we have to define the right data set we want to use to train the machine. And maybe that could be a goal for the Beyond Festival, and maybe for some working sessions or panel sessions, talk about what kind of data we need that we can train a machine that gives us some insights about the future we want to live in. I think there are many, many use cases. We can use AI for impact purposes. And this is, I think, also highly important to bring in these and to talk about the projects. We currently, just one additional thing, we at Birds on Mars, for example, are currently working on a project where we want to use artificial intelligence to find a better way to know which trees in the city of Berlin need water with a high priority, because drying of trees is a huge thing, and all the trees need water, and a huge challenge is to know which trees need it most. And AI and the data about trees can help us to find to have a kind of support system that helps us to find the right trees to water. Just as one additional example. Maybe, Roman, you have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. I hope that the AI translation program is doing well, because I will continue in German if I may. Ja, das ist eine sehr interessante und komplexe Frage, was eigentlich, was mich interessiert, also nicht interessiert. Also natürlich ich mit diesem Konzept der direkte Kooperation kann ich da ja auch ein Wort sprechen, denn mir geht es natürlich nicht wirklich um ein konkretes Thema, sondern eine Methode, wie man dann nicht nur kreativ wird, aber komplett seine Lebensanstellung, oder beziehungsweise Lebensanstellung ändert in Bezug auf Verschiedenes. Und so eben, konnte man auch in diesem Kontext Umweltschutz auch implementieren, wenn die Methode zum Beispiel erlaubt, außer Institutionen, aus den großen Unternehmen ganz individuell zusammenzuarbeiten und dadurch irgendwie auch Ressourcen schon schützen und aber auch besseren und direkten Zugang zueinander haben. In einem Sinn der Interdisziplinarität und der Kooperation. Und die Fragen, die vorher gestellt wurden, die gefallen mir sehr und natürlich auch die Antworten sehr spannend. Und ich denke, es gibt sehr viele Ideen, wie man mit künstlicher Intelligenz, wie man künstliche Intelligenz ansetzen kann und auch die Kreativität in verschiedene Arten und Weisen unterstützen kann. Und die Ideen sind alle, wir haben etwas Gemeinsames im Sinn und deswegen ich bin wirklich glücklich, dass es so viele Leute gibt, die sich damit neulich beschäftigen, auch zunehmend auch Künstler, die sich da für die neue Technologien öffnen und verschiedene Modelle weiterentwickeln und ja, erstmal so viel.
Ja, und das Beyond zeigt ja vor allem auch,
Genau.
und die Beispiele, die wir auch heute noch von den Kolleginnen und Kollegen gehört haben, dass sich glücklicherweise viel mehr auch mit neuen Möglichkeiten zum Einsatz von KI beschäftigt wird, weil in den letzten Jahren gerade auch eben so von den üblichen verdächtigen großen Unternehmen ist es schon meistens eher das schneller, schneller, weiter, mehr und in Richtung Automatisierung, und das hat natürlich auch zum Großteil alles seine Berechtigung, aber es gibt halt viel, viel weitere Wege, künstliche Intelligenz einzusetzen. Und da braucht es eben das Engagement von uns allen, auch an diesen Wegen aktiv zu arbeiten und auch wieder andere Leute zu inspirieren, sich zu überlegen, wie wir diese Technologie eben auch auf kreative Art und Weise einsetzen können.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian and Roman, but also Matthias, Dave, and Refik for this first panel this morning. We're gonna continue with an art presentation right now by Refik Anadol, and then we'll be back for the afternoon panel at 1 o'clock, I guess. And please enjoy the art presentation by Refik Anadol. Stay with us the whole day. Thank you.
Ja.
Ich habe jetzt nur ich fürchte, im Regieplan hatte ich auch nur 4 Sprecher jetzt, aber es sind 5, ne? Das sind die auf der Website. Okay. Hallo.
Der ist der Erste.